This presentation will be about counter arguments for AP English language. I think that it applies to all three of the timed writings, but especially I think the synthesis timed writing and the rhetorical analysis timed writing. So there are 3 or 4 ways, depending on which timed writing we're talking about, to get the sophistication point, but the following language is in all 3 of the rubrics for all 3 of the timed writings. You can get the sophistication point by crafting a nuanced argument, by consistently identifying and exploring complexities or tensions, and you can get the sophistication point by articulating the implications or limitations of an argument. It's important to remember that you do not have to do all of the things in the sophistication rubric to get that sophistication point. You only need to do one of them. I think that counter-arguing, if done well, could hit either one of these bullet points for this sophistication point. So what does a counter-argument do? Well, according to Harvard, there are several things that a counter-argument does, but I've pulled out the ones that I think are most relevant to an AP English language class. And on this slide by writer, I mean the student writer, not the writer of the passage or the writer of the sources. I mean the student writer here. So we might counter-argue a problem with the writer's conclusion. So you come to a conclusion somewhere in the paper about whatever it is you're writing about, and so then you come up with a different conclusion that other people might see, might interpret, and you counter the other conclusion. Or an assumption, kind of working the same way as a conclusion. Sometimes we use a key term, and it runs throughout the essay. And so we define it in one way, but another person might define that key term in another way. And so you would counter the alternate definition of that key term. You might talk about evidence that the writer hasn't considered, that the student writer hasn't considered yet. So you would bring in new evidence into a body paragraph that ends the paper or the conclusion, and then you would argue why that evidence wasn't necessary for your argument. A drawback to the writer's thesis. So this is literally the counter thesis, the counter argument of your thesis statement. If there's a weakness within it, in the conclusion or in a body paragraph that ends the paper, you could address the weakness of your thesis and explain why it is not actually a weakness and why your thesis can stand on its own without that evidence. And then finally, and I think this is probably the most common way that an AP English language, or maybe the easiest way that an AP English language writer can get the sophistication point and can do a counter argument successfully. You can have an alternative interpretation of the evidence. So you've presented the evidence and you've interpreted the evidence and you've analyzed and commented on the evidence. What would somebody else do with that evidence? How would it differ from what you would do? And why is your interpretation of the evidence superior to somebody else's interpretation of the evidence? So let's take a look at a possible counter argument. Here's a thesis from To Kill a Mockingbird. I've chosen To Kill a Mockingbird because most high school students have read this book. So the thesis that I've come up with, I think, is very controversial. The town of Macomb discriminates against Boo Radley and Tom Robinson, making them characters that present a similar message. So I think it's controversial because I'm equating Boo and Tom, and Boo is white and is alive at the end of the novel, and Tom is black and has been murdered at the end of the novel. So I do think that it's a controversial thesis. So how would I go about arguing against those who think my thesis is controversial and incorrect? So there's the thesis at the top of this slide, and I'm not going to read this paragraph to you, but everything that is italicized is my thesis repeated within this conclusion, and everything that is in bold is the counter argument to my thesis. So it's me dealing with the counter argument to my thesis. So you can see that there's much more bolded here than there is italicized. And that's because when we counter argument, we have to stay with the counter argument. Too often, the counter argument becomes what is bolded at the top of this paragraph, and then the rest of the paragraph is just a retreat into what the body has already presented. And so it becomes a traditional paragraph with a counter argument at the top that isn't actually explored. So the number one thing that I would say students should not do when they're writing a counter argument is they should not retreat from their counter argument. Don't retreat back to your argument. Always be countering. Don't be summarizing what you've already said. As I said before, a counter argument does not equal one sentence that presents the opposition and then uses the same arguments from the body to defend the thesis. That's just a traditional conclusion with an extra sentence added in. So let me give you a couple more examples if the To Kill a Mockingbird example doesn't work for you. So if I asked you what Taylor Swift songs are the best and why, your answer would be very different than if I asked you what songs are her worst and why. So imagine if I said Taylor Swift is a great singer, and here are the songs that I believe represent her the best. And someone else came along and said, Taylor Swift isn't good at all because look at these songs. I would then need to explore why the songs that have been cited as her worst are actually not more important than the songs I've already cited as her best. That's a fundamentally different answer and different paragraph and evidence and ideas and argument than you're making if you like Taylor Swift. Another example, to use sports, if you won a football game and I asked you why your team came out on top, you would have a fundamentally different answer than if I asked you what the other team did to lose. So at our high school, and I'm sure at high schools across the country, Monday is film day. And so the team will look at film from what they did on Friday night, and they will look at film for the upcoming game. And there are two ways to look at that film. You can look at that film and figure out ways that your team can exploit the other team's weaknesses, or you can look at that film and you can think about the way your team's strengths can actually outdo the other team. So is it about your team's strengths or is it about the other team's weaknesses? And the answer is it's about both, right? But it's a different conversation depending on which side we're talking about. Let me use tennis as an example as well. If we're serving in tennis and our opponent does not have a good backhand, we have a great serve, but our opponent doesn't have a good backhand, but we keep serving to our opponent's forehand and they keep returning the serve, we are not exploiting what they can't do. So if I said, tell me about your good serve, you might talk about the speed of your serve. You may talk about the top spin that you can get on your serve, but you wouldn't talk about being able to go out wide to your opponent's backhand. If I talked about what can't your opponent do against your serve, now all of a sudden you're talking about your opponent's backhand. Again, it's a very different conversation. And then let me take it one more place. Let me go to music, playing music. If you're in band or if you're in choir singing, there's a difference between asking yourself what you've played well or what you've sung well, what notes you've nailed, what notes that you have played perfectly. There's a difference between explaining that and having someone ask you, well, now wait a minute, you also messed up these notes. You still need to work harder in these places of the particular song. And you would have to argue that you're on your way, that you have advanced within the playing of the song enough that you are eventually going to be able to play the song. The glass is half full instead of half empty as far as the song that you're playing goes. I hope that this video helps a little bit with counter argument, and I hope that you will be able to use a counter argument body paragraph or a counter argument in your conclusion to get the sophistication point on the AP English Language free response section.